Welcome everyone to the ANU Archives Annual Lecture. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose lands we meet and pay our respects to elders past and present. I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. My name is Catherine Dan, University Archivist at the ANU, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to the first ANU Archives Lecture delivered online, and to introduce our speaker, Associate Professor Ruth Morgan. Although we are operating in a different mode, I hope the online experience means that more people from many locations can participate. Just a few online housekeeping matters. Please post any questions during the lecture to the chat box. We'll monitor these and ask them at the end of the lecture. There's a button on the Zoom toolbar to open the chat. This event is being recorded and will be made available online afterwards. If you lose connection, rejoin using the Zoom link you were sent. Each year, the ANU Archives organises a public lecture in conjunction with the Friends of the Noel Archives Centre. The Friends are very supportive of the Archives work, particularly via their fundraising for conservation work. The Conservation Fund assists us by covering the costs of preserving significant and fragile items. We've treated 31 items in the last 10 years, including many pre-Federation trade union minute books, which were inscribed in the UNESCO Memory of the World Register. This year, we commissioned treatment on minutes dating back to the 1890s from the Amalgamated Glass Bottle Makers Trade Protection Society of New South Wales and the Victorian Tailoresses Union. Our thanks to the Friends for their support of the archives through the lecture and conservation funding. And if you'd like to know more about the Friends or to join, there's information on our website. Archives need researchers who will read against the grain, understand the context of how the records came to be, and incorporate their findings in narratives about the present. There's enormous scope in our holdings of records from companies and trade unions, research material on the Pacific, the National HIV/AIDS Archive, and archives of the ANU and its academics for researchers to use and to read the content in ways not anticipated at the time of creation. It's the essence of using archives, and I'm delighted that our speaker today is using the records of the past in work that speaks to pressing contemporary issues, understanding our climate. Ruth Morgan is Director of the Centre for Environmental History and Associate Professor in the School of History at ANU. She's an environmental historian and historian of science with particular research interests in water and climate histories of Australia, the British Empire and the Indian Ocean world, and is author of Running Out: Water in Western Australia. Ruth is Vice President of the International Consortium of Environmental History Organisations and the International Commission on the History of Meteorology, and Treasurer of the International Water History Association. Her research has been supported by the Australian Research Council, the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, and the Rachel Carson Centre for Environment and Society. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Ruth Morgan on the topic Archives for a Dry and Drying Climate.
Okay, let me get set up here. Okay, thank you so much, Catherine, for that introduction. And before I begin, I'd like to add my acknowledgements and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting and where I live and work, the Ngunnawal, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri peoples, to their elders past and present, and to acknowledge that their sovereignty has never been ceded. It's a real honour to be given this opportunity to speak to you this evening, and it's really wonderful to have a chance to speak to people in the flesh. Even teaching is always a bit hit and miss at the moment. Sometimes you're in class with real people, but often it's just online. So by all accounts, 2020 has been a remarkable year. Bushfires of unprecedented duration and spread, smoke, hail, and then a pandemic. All these trials have led us to wonder, when will this be over? When will we return to normal? But what normal is in a dry and drying land is especially elusive. Ever since the bushfires that swept across the continent during the long, savage summer, the air has become a focus for anxiety and for control. Winds swept the bushfire smoke across the Pacific. New Zealand's glaciers turned brown from the smoke, ash and dust that would likely accelerate the season's glacier melt. Still further east, the bushfire smoke reached South America and turned their skies red, and continued to circumnavigate the globe over the Southern Ocean. With every breath, our bodies were processing the planet. For weeks, the capital cities of Brisbane, Melbourne, Sydney, and Canberra, and everything in between, were shrouded in smoke. Those that could stayed indoors, bought masks, even packed their bags and headed south to Tasmania to escape. As you can see here, air quality index readings above 200 are considered hazardous to health. On some days, these cities and their suburbs had the worst air quality in the world, overtaking those usual suspects of Beijing and Delhi, whose residents every day pay a high price for rapid industrialisation. Somehow their everyday became our extraordinary. As historian Kavita Phillip puts it, it is the poor and marginalised in every nation who has already had to pay the costs of extreme climate events. They are the canaries in the coal mine, the markers of our climatic futures. But to see this unfold, we don't have to look too far. In June, Byami Williamson, a Ualalai academic here at the ANU, gave evidence at the Royal Commission into National Natural Disaster Resilience. There he shared the results of a working paper that studied Aboriginal peoples and the response to the bushfires. This research found that the Indigenous population in areas hit by the bushfires was double the Indigenous population in the affected states as a whole, meaning that Indigenous people were disproportionately affected by the savage summer. Further still, he reported, 1 in 10 children affected by the bushfires is Indigenous. Of the 22 Aboriginal communities in rural fire-affected areas, 20 are in New South Wales, often living on former mission lands and reserves. I can't breathe. The battle cry to end Aboriginal deaths in custody is a demand for justice, and environmental justice is racial justice. Climate change is the product of particular historical processes of extraction, industrialisation, colonialism, and development, of particular ways of living for the few at the expense of the many. Climate change amplifies existing social and environmental injustice. Environmental histories can show the continuities and pathways that have led to this predicament, as well as offer critical historical insights into the possibilities that lie ahead. The bushfires, climate change, COVID-19, all crises unfolding at vast scales, the regional, the global, and the planetary, accumulating over generations, while also manifesting locally, now, already, in starkly different personal and very often in unequitable ways. Whether it's been in response to the bushfires or COVID-19, all manner of institutions have encouraged recording this time as it affects individuals, families, and communities, and contributing these impressions and imprints to their collections. Some of the appeal of these initiatives has been not only thinking about the historians of the future, but also in the small acts of agency that arise from making meaning of this particular moment to show that it mattered. Environmental humanities scholars have echoed this collection's approach in their own efforts to grapple with the concept of the Anthropocene, the geological epoch of human-caused planetary change. In their work, they reckon with the kind of debris of future remains that will remain in the Earth's strata in this age of humans. They talk of plastic, soot from power stations, concrete, nuclear waste, even the bones of the domestic chicken. With all kinds of objects, they conjure cabinets of curiosities for the Anthropocene, which is based on the European Wunderkammern of the 16th and 17th centuries. And as the editors of this collection Future Remains note, to collect objects of the Anthropocene is to register the diverse emotional responses: loss, grief, hubris, humility, anger and pain, among others, all evoked in a climate of change and uncertainty. The contributors to the new edited collection Living with the Anthropocene also work with objects and stories around Australia, which are now on their way to the National Museum. The editors argue that this project seeks to shift the lens of the Anthropocene from the global and systemic to the realm of everyday experience. It is also to shorten our gaze, focusing less about how our time will be remembered in the distant fossil record and more on how the Anthropocene is. These attempts to situate the Anthropocene in particular places complements the call of historian Gabrielle Hecht to treat the concept and its critiques as scalar projects. Following geographers' efforts to ground the Anthropocene, Hecht seeks in her own study of an African Anthropocene a means of holding the planet and a place on the planet on the same analytic plane. And the purpose of doing so is twofold. Firstly, it allows for the acknowledgement of what Rob Nixon calls the unequal weight of human communities possessing disparate, earth-changing powers. And second, it makes the planetary scale of the Anthropocene mentally manageable, which may foster a sense of agency at more local scales. As Amitav Ghosh observed in The Great Derangement, in the era of global warming, nothing is far away. There is no place where the orderly expectations of life hold unchallenged sway. For environmental historians, at least, this task of engaging with human and non-human scales of time and space is a familiar one. The very method of historical writing provides highways for what Hecht describes as interscalar vehicles. As environmental historian Tom Griffiths argues, environmental history frequently makes more sense on a regional or global scale than it does on a national one. It uniquely bridges planetary and deeply local perspectives, staking a claim for historians that are bound intimately to place and also embrace the natural world, histories that are deeply attentive to human biological parochialism. And he attempts this himself in an autobiographical sketch that details his own coming of age in the Great Acceleration. He writes of growing up in the blooming suburbia of 1950s Melbourne and the Cold War space race, and he finds common ground in the very source of these advances, their mobilisation by the same unsustainable energy systems. In short, he demonstrates how historians can render the planetary personal and the personal planetary. Take my own case. Every month since February 1985 has seen above average global temperatures compared with the 20th century. I was born in late 1984. I don't remember a normal month. And writing across these scales might help to illuminate the conundrum of our environmental crisis. Although we are collectively the cause of anthropogenic climate change, we experience climate change unevenly, and our political agency complicates collective action. Australian scientists and historians have been very much involved in defining the Anthropocene, its meaning, its origins, and its very futures. For the historians, at least, this work is part of a wider project of engaging with place. In environmental history and elsewhere, the words of Keith Hancock remain influential. Recalling the English historian R.H. Tawney, Hancock would remind historians of land use that they need not only more documents, but stronger boots. And by this, he meant that they needed to look for evidence not only in archives and libraries, but also in paddocks and fields. And we might go beyond paddocks and fields to oceans, mountains, glaciers, and so forth. That Australian environmental historians should be so engaged with expanding on the Anthropocene comes as no surprise to the historian of science, Alison Bashford. She argues that local imperatives have long demanded that historians come to terms with deep time, prehistory and modern history, or natural, Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia, of a land shaped by humans for at least 70,000 years. She argues that the history of the island continent of Australia and its peoples confounds the northern idea of civilization as a historical marker. She also notes the relationship between Australia's colonial history and the history of the Anthropocene. The British colonisation of Australia from 1788 is tantalisingly close, she observes, to James Watts's invention of the steam engine, the date that was originally proposed for the advent of the Anthropocene. And it was coal from the rich seams in Australia, Asia, Canada and Africa that fueled the workshops of the world and precipitated the expansion of the British Empire. As a consequence, Bashford wonders, is modern Australia the Anthropocene's twin? If not the Anthropocene's twin, Australia is certainly family. The nation's per capita carbon emissions are the second highest in the OECD and among the highest in the world. Chief among the sources of those emissions are the nation's energy, transport and agricultural sectors. Meanwhile, the nearby low-lying islands of the Pacific have become as much symbols and sentinels of global warming and rising sea levels as polar bears and melting glaciers. These islands, as the LeFou Declaration of 2015 states, are among the most severely affected in the world by climate change. But Pacific Island countries and territories' emissions count for a mere 0.03% of global greenhouse gas emissions. But, as the Pacific climate warriors remind us, the peoples of the Pacific are not victims. We are not drowning, we are fighting. So too are the so-called Torres Strait 8, the 8 traditional owners from across the Torres Strait who last year lodged a complaint against the Australian government with the UN's Human Rights Committee, highlighting the threat of climate change to their culture and to their ability to live on their own home islands. The Australian government has attempted to block this complaint, dismissing the issue as a problem for the future rather than the present. So the divergent ways in which the Anthropocene manifests in the global south and the global north are starkly evident in our own part of the world. I think it's safe to say we've all thought at some point this year, when will we go back to normal? Perhaps we should be careful what we wish for, as Mununjali author Ellen van Neerven reminds their readers, normal was a crisis. But in climate terms at least, we are headed towards what's been called a new normal. A couple of years ago, climate scientists showed that on the current trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions, global temperatures like 2015 will be normal by 2030, if not warmer. The so-called angry and savage summers of the past few years will seem relatively mild within the next 2 decades. Now, although climate scientists have tried to clarify this terminology of a new normal, the language of a new climate implies that climate change is not of us, it's somehow a part. But both history and science tell us otherwise, that climate change is a story of continuity rather than rupture. And it's to this climate continuity that I want to turn to now. Just have a quick drink, if I may. In scientific terms, climate is a matter of both time and place. We can think of climate as the accumulation of all the daily weather observations at a given location. Moreover, as historian of science Vladimir Yankovic puts it, the climate as a scientific concept cannot exist prior to data, and data prior to archives. And climate scientists regularly turn to the past to try to understand what is within the normal range of natural climate variability in order to determine whether recent conditions are exceeding that climate envelope. This research often involves pre-modern and colonial documentary archives, what historian of science Lorraine Daston calls third nature, the repository of findings of scientific empiricism that converted first nature into second nature. And teams of researchers work together on these projects of data rescue, which is digitising weather data that is not in electronic form. And this kind of work, probably not in its computer or digitised form, has certainly been underway since the 1960s with efforts to analyse historical European and North American climates, usually working with instrumental measurements from thermometers and rain gauges, as well as observations of climate proxies that provide indirect data like grape harvests and tax income receipts. And finally, the matter of narratives of weather conditions. And now historians, geographers and scientists are turning to these materials to study the climates of Southern Africa, South and Southeast Asia, the Caribbean and Mexico. Missionary accounts have revealed precipitation and temperature variability in sub-Saharan Africa, while private diaries have allowed a climate reconstruction of early 19th century Bombay. Similarly, ship's logs, as well as missionary and plantation papers, provide the basis for the reconstruction of rainfall variability and hurricane activity in the Southern Caribbean. So this quantitative and qualitative information has been vital to international and regional endeavours to extend the global climate record, to reconstruct past climates of former colonies, and to understand colonial climate anxieties and change. In some cases, these projects have been interdisciplinary, drawing together expertise from historians familiar with analysing the archival sources and scientists familiar with extracting and processing and calibrating the relevant information. For example, the Eureka Prize-winning Southeastern Australian Recent Climate History Project, it becomes the SEARCH acronym, which I think is what they were going for. This brought together historical climatologists, environmental historians, meteorologists, and an army of volunteer citizen scientists to piece together the climate history of colonial New South Wales from 1788 to 1860. And by analysing documentary sources, this is their work here, such as newspapers and accounts of early colonists, they extended the instrumental climate record for southeastern Australia to invasion, which they used to examine climate variability and change in the region, such as how the El Niño Southern Oscillation fluctuated during the 19th century. Of course, these analyses of climate and society are only possible because of the extensive record keeping of pre-modern and colonial observers. Then, as now Yankovic reminds us, there has never been climate data that had not already been destined to be archived. The expansion of European and North American empires during the 18th and 19th centuries helped to facilitate the rise of Western science, which in turn reinforced the imperial enterprise. And among the sciences aligned with empire, such as botany, geography, and geology, was the emerging science of meteorology. Historian Jan Golinski has shown how an increasingly quantitative approach to weather observation surpassed local folk traditions in Britain by the early 19th century. So by this time, Western climate discourses had actually begun to separate, such that climate was now largely understood both as an agent or force and as an index or set of statistics as we're familiar with it today. The roots of this former discourse lay in a historical climate determinism, while the latter had emerged more recently as the product of empirical weather observation and the development of meteorology and climatology. Now, in the colonial context at least, climatology was not coming at the expense of this agential interpretation of historical and climate determinism, which flourished in the face of new geographies of risk and opportunity. Indeed, both approaches thrived when the paucity of instrumental data beckoned for measurement, observation, and interpretation. Quantitative approaches to weather recording fostered imperial understandings of climate in statistical terms as an index by which to assist the achievement of imperial objectives. Moreover, the study of colonial climate itself became an instrument of imperial rule and resistance. European and North American empires established observatories to foster the systematic collection of meteorological statistics in their colonial territories. And later, such observatories became hubs for the collection of climate data, recorded around the colonies, often by volunteers and local peoples, and from other colonial outposts. Stocked with European instruments and staffed by military, if not scientific observers, observatories were to be the sites of colonial science and imperial authority. And they became the hubs for the collection and the distribution of climate knowledge, both across the colonies and back to the metropole, allowing for the interpretation of local and regional climate patterns. Facilitated by the advent of the telegraph, their interpretations were critical to the development of weather forecasting, a predictive science vital to the agricultural and maritime endeavours of empire. The late Richard Grove, for instance, has shown how the exchange of meteorological data between India and the Australian colonies in the 1880s allowed the South Australian meteorologist Charles Todd to identify the coincidence of drought conditions in both regions. And these would later be described as the consequence of that atmospheric ocean phenomenon, the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So here we see how colonial ideas about the weather and the climate intersected with geographical spaces and scientific practices and were shaped by their social worlds. Geographers Martin Mahoney and Angelo Cagliotti describe this as relocating meteorology, borrowing from Kapil Raja's Relocating Modern Science. In this, he called for a historiographical revolution in how we deal with the development of Western sciences, appealing for a shift in processes of diffusion from metropole to periphery, towards instead models of circulation and intercultural encounter in the production of inherently hybrid forms of knowledge. In the case of Charles Todd and drought in South Asia and southeastern Australia, for instance, we might look more closely into how this observation was even possible. Girdling Australia with the telegraph had been one of Todd's many accomplishments since his arrival in South Australia in 1855. In 1870, he embarked on his crowning achievement, the construction of the overland telegraph line from Adelaide to Darwin, which would connect the Australian colonies to Britain's cable empire, at the heart of which lay British India. 2 years later, the telegraphic cable between England and Australia was complete. In hours rather than weeks, a message could now be tapped out in Morse code in London, travel along the submarine cable to Lisbon and Gibraltar, then on to Alexandria by overland telegraph to Suez, by cable via Aden to Bombay, overland again to Madras, by cable once again to Penang, Singapore and Batavia, overland to Banyuwangi, under the sea to Darwin, and finally along Todd's overland telegraph line to Adelaide in South Australia. This accelerated flow of information across a wide expanse of the globe was not only celebrated by merchants and news agencies, but for Todd, the electric telegraph, which is to the meteorologist what the telescope is to the astronomer, has done much to help us. The observer's outlook is no longer confined to his immediate locality. The telegraph tells him day by day and at any hour what are the atmospheric conditions over a large portion of the Earth's surface. His Victorian colleague, Robert Ellery, agreed, declaring that through the receipt of telegrams, we are now able to plot or lay out on charts showing the movements of the atmosphere all over the world. And what these two meteorologists were observing was the telegraph's role in shrinking the 19th century world, that technology that, along with railways and steamships, would serve to annihilate space and time. But for all the modernity that this technology represented, it was not an autonomous technology. It still needed to be operated by human hands. And these human hands, these human operators, worked in the repeater stations that were spaced out at intervals along the telegraph line, from Arabunna country through Aranda lands to Warramunga country and beyond. Far from the colonial hubs of Adelaide in the south and Port Darwin in the north, these stations required provisions to be delivered to them. And here we have an example of how that worked. As Postmaster General, Charles Todd entered an agreement with Faz and Taq Muhammad, camel proprietors, carriers and storekeepers to transport provisions from the railway head at Oodnadatta along the telegraph line. This agreement from 1893, and there were others, specifies that a total of 37 tonnes was to be delivered over the course of a journey to the telegraph stations at Charlotte Waters, then to Alice Springs, then Barrow Creek, and then Tennant Creek. And the expected distances involved are not explained in miles, but rather in camel time, in weeks. 3 weeks to Charlotte Waters, 8 weeks to Alice Springs, 12 weeks to Barrow Creek, and then 16 finally to Tennant Creek, all calculated from their departure from Oodnadatta. And there were penalties, not only for damaging the products, but for being late. Evidence of these kinds of arrangements have ended up here in the Elder Smith files at the Noel Butlin Archive Centre because non-white people from South Asia, like the Muhammad brothers, were prohibited from owning land in the Australian colonies. Forming these sorts of business partnerships with pastoral companies enabled them greater access to the colonial capitalist economy that was proliferating through the inland and enhancing the sums that they could eventually remit to their families still in British India. The survey of the Overland Telegraph followed Stuart's track through the inland, which, like so many other colonial ventures, followed Indigenous water routes. Just notice how each of the telegraph stations mentioned in Todd's agreement with the Muhammad brothers was named for waters, springs, creeks. Of course, in the desert, these sparse water points are sites of immense significance. For Aranda people, for instance, the waterholes near Charlotte Waters made that area an important emu ritual centre. Locating water, such as at these places, was a vital skill for survival in the arid inland and demands the development and persistence of particular biocultural knowledge. With invasion, those patterns of movement for water collided with the impulses of settler mobility, driven by the twin urges for land and resource extraction. And these colonial patterns largely elided those existing mobilities that had shaped particular geographies in these regions, such that they had been perceived as neither hydrologically nor culturally wanting by local peoples. It was water that defined those geographies, and the control of water became the means by which to deny them. As Samia Khatun argues so vividly in her work Australia Nama, colonial settlements on Aboriginal land were conjunctures of spatial epistemologies, and the archives generated at colonial encounters reveal with particular clarity that mobilities and geographies were structured by different knowledge traditions. As we in the southeast of the continent ponder what the new normal of a warmer world might look like or feel like, communities in Central Australia are already there. Temperature records have already been broken. In the year to July 2019, Alice Springs and Buntwa had 129 days over 35 degrees and 55 days over 40. Those temperatures were not supposed to arrive until 2030. And in many remote communities and outstations in Central Australia, drinking water supplies are deteriorating as the aquifers run low and the remaining supply goes saline. It's one of the cruel ironies of climate change. It's the product of imperialism and capitalism, impacting those who have gained the least from those processes the most, and while it's known through the enduring meteorological infrastructures of empire. For in these pre-modern and colonial networks of meteorological observation lie the intellectual and physical origins of the global monitoring systems that developed during the 20th century. Here on the slide, you can just make out the different densities of observations. Heavier in the far left of the slide, heavier in yellow, grey and blue in some parts of the world, just after the Second World War. That was from 1947. Historians of science have shown how increasingly automated networks of planetary observation emerged in the context of the Cold War. We can see just below the blue square, the centres of the International Geophysical Year of 1957. And these continuities continue to inform contemporary studies of environmental change, with the grey and blue spots showing what the data coverage of these networks looks like today. That's a combination of land data and Argo ocean buoys. But rather than discredit climate science or malign its practitioners, I'm careful to say that, opening up the stories embedded in climate data and the histories of its collection might instead invite a more nuanced and situated understanding of the continuities that underlie our warming world. As theorist Mackenzie Walk observes, you can run the numbers and show that climate change is really happening, but that doesn't change how people feel about it. And how they feel about it depends on who they are, where they are, and to what from their particular past they can connect it. Enduring climate change, let alone doing anything about it, may depend in part on the biggest, most diverse, most multilingual and multicultural conversation the planet has ever had. A modest step in that direction might be a project that puts what we know about Earth science in contact with the critical and post-colonial voices that have pushed back against imperial mappings of the world. For Swiss geographers Stefan Bronnemann and Janine Vincer, this kind of project involves what they have called in the scientific journal Nature, climate data empathy. As they point out, uneven data coverage has real political implications, such as the procedural injustice in climate policy that arises when you can't show the adverse effects of climate change in your country, which of course is a problem for countries with short instrumental climate records. So they argue that this unequal spatial coverage isn't just a data problem, but also one of climate justice. And they suggest that climate data empathy invites looking for and listening to other observation practices and knowledge traditions that tend to be marginalised in Western climate science, not least because traditional and Indigenous knowledge is not held in the kind of quantitative form that can be smoothly dovetailed into Western science. Attending to the inherent value and significance of non-Western ways of knowing is among the priorities of the current round of drafts for the IPCC, which has faced criticism for its failure to critically engage with Indigenous knowledge systems and peoples and the historical and contextual complexities of Indigenous experience. Doing so, though, isn't without its challenges. As Canadian geographer James Ford and his co-authors observe in their own critique, that greater engagement with Indigenous issues would necessarily involve the consideration of diverse issues such as land rights, dispossession, colonial histories, and access to resources that remain highly politicised topics in nations where Indigenous rights are contested or not even recognised. So these are questions of continuity, of how the past continues to shape the unfolding present in an uncertain future. If, as Lorraine Daston argues, the archive is the physical expression of how present science creates a usable past for future science, how the documentary Climate Archive came into being is a question that invites historical answers that are specific to particular places and peoples. And it is these answers that can offer tangible connections to distant places and complex planetary processes. After all, as Libby Robin has written of the Anthropocene imaginary, most people live somewhere. No one lives everywhere. Recovering and rescuing climate data, then, might be recast as part of an effort to relocalise climate science in relation to those local specificities, knowledges, and politics, in full recognition, as Ellen van Nieman reminds us, that what non-Indigenous peoples kept and recorded served their narrative purpose. Whether Indigenous or non-Indigenous, fiction or non-fiction, author James Bradley notes the emergence of a new kind of writing. He observes that time and again one sees the way attention to the small and specific reveals the unseen whole. And despite their interest in the particular and the local, their structures and outlooks embody the fluidity and complexity of globalisation, emphasising connections and resonances across time and space. These narratives are like the objects and the stories of the Bushfire, COVID-19 and Anthropocene collections that I shared earlier. And to these I might add another piece, the burnt remains of a home. In early February, Greenpeace supported a bushfire survivor, Melinda Plessman, in bringing the remains of her incinerated home from Nimboida, near Grafton, to the lawns of Parliament House here in Canberra. She wanted the impact of the bushfires on her life, on her community, to be seen. She wanted her story to be heard. Her story was one of many from the bushfires that burned over 3,000 homes across almost 19 million hectares, claiming the lives of 33 people and more than 1 billion animals. Numbers alone did not and could not tell her story. The Indigenous author Tony Burch describes our moment as being in the middle of a storm of our own making. How we in the global north, in Australia, made that storm is the focus of environmental history, of connecting people to place. Furthermore, environmental history is a necessary corrective to the temptation to mythologise particular environmental pasts that legitimise business as usual. To my mind, these are connected projects, the demand of environmental history, compelling narratives that situate real people and real places in the real past. Situating what Andrea Gaynor calls radical remembering in place encourages not only temporal thinking, but also collective thinking of shared places, of community with people and other creatures as an antidote to the prevalence of atomistic anthropogenic self-interest. Writing about the history of climate data archiving in the United States National Climate Program, Vladimir Yankovic observed that the fact that we design archives as sites holding historical records of atmospheric events reflects not only our wish to preserve the past, but our expectation that such a record may serve a future. And it thus relates to, borrowing from Derrida, a promise and of a responsibility for tomorrow. By recovering climate data and restoring them to place and to history with empathy and with hope, we might then find archives for a dry and drying land.
Thank you, Ruth. It is great to hear about how archives can be a component, be a part of such a range of sources. Going from thinking about that statistical, the human experience and the archives. I'm going to throw a few questions at you now. There are some coming through on the chat, and I would encourage anyone who is online, if you have a question, to put it into the chat. The first one is about, it's really about digitisation, and was something that occurred to me also. The question online is whether you're aware of the quantity of Australian climate or weather records that are hidden in archives not easily accessible because they haven't been digitised. So from pastoral companies and so on. And my sort of spin on that is, given the vast quantity that may be held in archives, is digitisation the answer? And, how do we prioritise? Because, in fact, it's a long and very costly process.
Yes, and resources are scarce in this department. Yes, it's such a challenge, and I think apart from the rescuing access, the rescuing aspect of that project is also how the digitisation allows all manner of people to be working on that data input process at once. So in some ways, it's a very efficient way for the purposes of the climate data side of things, which I appreciate. But I can see how then, when you're having to prioritise all different kinds of digitisation projects, where does this one fall, and how do we prioritise, as you say? I suppose it's that question of whether or not we can extend the climate record back, which is where I think the search project, which is now Climate History Australia, based at ANU, they're trying to extend beyond southeastern Australia. So expanding that record beyond there is certainly, those sorts of issues are important ones when you're trying to overcome that scarcity and sparseness of that coverage.
So could you expand a little bit on the sort of the citizen science aspect, which I think is really interesting, because a lot of the early meteorological data was people who were interested or volunteered to gather that information, and it's almost like we're paralleling that now with people transcribing. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
I mean, as you say, it seems like a bit of a tradition, really. And I think it's because weather is something that is so personal, so local, and particularly for places like Australia, where you did have that, I suppose, low density of colonial settlement. People did take it upon themselves to record the conditions at their outpost, I suppose, in the colonies. And so you actually have quite a diverse range of colonists contributing to that early meteorological project, women among them. Of course, that data then has to be scrubbed and polished to make sure that when you're doing your recovery and rescue that it does align with the more modern methods. But what is interesting about the citizen science, and I think we've seen it with Trove as well, how it's something that I think many people from many different walks of life can engage in. But I know with the climate work that they're often using the wide reach of the project to get multiple people involved in the same record, so that when things aren't so clear, which is often the case with handwriting, that it's double checked, triple checked. I think one I saw there were 8 people working simultaneously on the same columns of weather data just to make sure that they were collecting it, digitizing it as accurately as possible.
Okay, very good. We do have a few people in the room. I might open the floor.
Put them on the spot.
Put them on the spot. If anybody would like to pose a question to Ruth.
What strikes me, Ruth, about your work now is how closely you have been working with scientists and hard science. Have you as a historian sometimes found that language difficult? Because we do speak in different ways. Our narratives are different. Our way of ordering the world is different.
Yes, it certainly has its moments, and whether they're hydrologists and engineers or whether they're climate scientists, finding that middle ground, and also I think trying to find the common language, as you say, but also recognising the shared project that you're working on, and that working together is actually going to create potentially something stronger, something more effective than what we would separately achieve. So the language is certainly an issue. Differences of disciplinary hierarchy, those sorts of things. And I think also thinking about the kinds of audiences that you're working towards. So that's something that's been interesting with the IPCC, of thinking, well, who are we writing for? And trying to work out how to pitch ourselves accordingly to on the one hand, engage with policymakers and government, on the other, then trying to allow a wider audience to engage with this kind of scientific material, because it can be very impenetrable. So trying to find that middle ground where it's still robust and scientific, but also can be used in multiple ways.
So thank you so much for an absolutely fantastic talk. You talked a little bit about agency, which really made me start to think about how we see the tension in the system between individuals who, particularly in properties, are recording climate change data, and they see that very much as their personal record and often don't share that, and identify with it in different ways. And institutions like the Telegraph that has recorded that for a greater public purpose and is committed to a different form of utilising data and seeing that in a national scale. And I guess I'd be interested in your thoughts about what you see as the tension between the creators and the owners of that data, and what is the responsibility of archives in bringing those together in new and different forms that acknowledges the narrative and different strengths.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and I don't know whether it's often considered enough, as you say, that for someone on a private property, quite often that weather data is intimately related to the value of the land and to the connection to their place. And it was interesting in earlier work that I've done on Western Australia, how quite often there was a real eagerness to deny that a drought was happening, because that was going to diminish the worth of that property. So there was a lot of hesitation about drought declaration. And so I imagine that, for a lot of people that are holding these records, it's very much about their connection to that place, and that this is some kind of material manifestation of their own understanding of where they live. And as you say, it is very different to an institutional or public source. So I think this is where more of providing that context, of making that clear. I mean, sometimes I think we see in terms of the mapping of this data, a differential a way of visually showing that these are institutional records versus private. But I don't think it's always picked up, and I think it's a really interesting tension to explore further. I think it's also interesting when you see these records that are actually being shared as part of a wider suite of personal papers. And so again, seeing those out of context entirely changes the ways in which we can understand that data. It's not just the weather data alone, it's people's whole family histories of being on a particular property and everything that came along with that.
Thank you. I might just take a couple from online,
Sure.
as we have had a flurry now. So thanks, Ruth, great paper. Can you talk a bit more about some of the work you've become aware of, which is engaging with Indigenous and other cultural knowledges? And this is very interesting because, of course, many of our archives are essentially colonial stories. And so this is a real challenge for the archivist as well. So if you could talk about that, that would be really interesting.
Yeah, it's something that I must regret that I'm not especially strong at myself because of my own linguistic shortcomings, but it's certainly something that Samia Khatun and Laura Ruddermaker here as well at the ANU have written extensively about how unfortunately, lack of second languages, languages other than English, whether they're Indigenous languages, whether they're languages from other countries, it really limits what we can get from our materials. Maybe this is where digitisation could be another thing of showing that these materials are there and then finding ways in which we can crowdsource translation. Maybe that's another way to get those stories out. Of course, not all of those stories are to be shared, and that's the other challenging aspect. Or they might not seem familiar or understandable when they're removed from their context. And so that's the other challenge when you're telling other people's stories of how to do that appropriately. And when it's environmental knowledge and when that's about country, I think that's a really challenging issue to grapple with.
Do you think historians are also playing a role in creating climate archives?
Ooh. Yes, I think so, along with anthropologists, especially in terms of, I mean, there's the historians that work with the more instrumental data and the analysing of those more familiar documentary sources, but certainly in the Arctic or glacier regions, historians are working closely with local communities so that when there is, say, an ice core sample or records of glacier melt, that they're not just interpreted through the lens of Western climate science and Western history, that they actually are interpreted in that wider meaning. And historians have been very much involved in that process, bringing that humanities lens, bringing the humans back into the story.
Yeah, which kind of links to another issue that's come through. You mentioned that in these times of crisis, those sorts of times seem to lend themselves to the desire for people and organisations to collect materials to mark the moment and acknowledge the significance of what's happening and what they're experiencing. So do you have any thoughts about what these collections are actually representative of and how they might be used in the future?
Yeah, it's a tricky one because I suppose the whole collecting impulse appeals to a certain person, and so that might end up and I suppose different materials are likely to be collected by different people. But I think what it is hopefully going to mean is that we do have a rich cross section, especially as some of the screenshots that I shared were from Facebook. These are very accessible forms of accessing what have often been, I think, understood, particularly by marginalised peoples, as very elite institutions. And so hopefully this is going to chip away at some of that facade, and hopefully that those stories of other people who aren't normally found, we can see how other people have been, well, a whole range of people have been represented and experiencing this moment.
I might take this one as the last one. It links to that last comment that you made. So it's a question about whether institutional copyright and other sort of access conditions or restrictions, particularly on institutional records, are impeding climate data and knowledge. And so what are your thoughts on citizen activist archives as a means to preserve archives into the future?
Ooh. Yeah, that is a tricky one. The restrictions, certainly some of those more recent, the embargoes and so forth of the past 30 years. I think that is interesting, especially when you're starting to dig into the history of climate policy. Perhaps not the data so much, but I have been ferreting around in the National Archives of late, and as it creeps closer to the 1990s, the documents on greenhouse concerns are very rich and interesting, and they make for very interesting reading. But as for the data itself, I think, of the instrumental data, I should say, I'm not aware of it being an issue as yet, but that's not to say it's not a problem. And I think perhaps for, that's speaking from the Australian context, no doubt in other parts of the world, there are limits, there are restrictions, and we've certainly seen in the United States all kinds of interference in archiving practice. So it's not just something that is an issue for developing countries, but even in the developed world, I think that vigilance around access to those sorts of records is really important.
I might close there, looking at the time. Thank you once again. I'm going to call on the chair of the Friends to say a few words, but just my personal thanks. It's actually been really fascinating and great to see archives living through your work.
Thanks, thanks so much,
I'd now like to call on Bruce Skates, who is chair of the Friends Committee, to say a few words.
Thank you.
Well, as Catherine has said, it falls on me as chair of the Friends to move this brief vote of thanks for what I think was a really astounding lecture in difficult circumstances. At the very beginning of her talk, Ruth referred to that founding figure of environmental history, W.K. Hancock. The Hancock is, of course, very much, the ANU is very much Hancock's turf, and Ruth evoked that lovely image of him in his strong boots trudging across what we now quaintly call the meadow, not the paddock,
sorry.
but the meadow. So I'm going to take my cue from Hancock too. Hancock wrote much on the craft of history, and he believed that all great historical endeavour required what he called attachment and span. And I think we saw both qualities tonight in Ruth's lecture. As so befits environmental history, what a carefully grounded lecture this was, grounded appropriately in the archives, whereas Ruth has reminded us the testimony of past generations belie all the claims of the climate change deniers today. She evoked a sense of place, an attachment to those places through artful quotation. That lovely line girdling the continent with the telegraph stand out for me. A very skillful reckoning with statistics, a skill we don't always see this side of the creek, Ruth.
Don't push me too far.
And beautifully contextualised by your birthday with that. And a visual narratives which I think left many of us breathless. That opening image of Australia by satellite with those fires erupting across our landscape in that terrible summer remains with me still. The span of this lecture was simply astonishing. In less than an hour, and I think probably a bit more by camel time, Ruth ranged the length and the breadth of our continent. She had more than a passing glance across to Africa and the Pacific, the Caribbean and Mexico. There was a fascinating mention of the environmental data exchange between Australia and India. India once part of our landscape and still a frame of reference today. Environmental history, as Ruth has showed us, thus escapes the boundaries of state and national borders, something many of us in COVID confinement truly long to do. As Ruth put it, it's an amalgam of the regional, the local, and the planetary. We saw all of that tonight. Ruth's topics tonight were equally wide-ranging. A drying continent, she's shown us, sets the stage for all manner of calamities: decline of water quality, accelerating temperature, narrowing biodiversities, and the bushfires that seem poised to wreak havoc on the land. And that span finally was reflected in her great interdisciplinary reach. The lecture we've had tonight was illuminated quite literally, thanks to PowerPoint, with examples from hard science, local folk traditions, climate data empathy, the burnt remains of a home, what a powerful image, citizen science, and the Indigenous knowledge that from time immemorial has nurtured love and knowledge of our country. And as Ruth has shown us, we have need of that love and knowledge today. I just want to return quickly to that metaphor of a stage to close on, because what Ruth reminded us tonight is that the dramatic changes taking place all around us are not prescripted or predetermined or choreographed in any way. What I liked most about your lecture, as my colleague here in the audience did, was that sense of agency, that sense of alternative possibilities, of historical contingencies, the opportunities missed, but also those that still remain. The history you sketched for us tonight is full of dire warning, but it's not without choice and hope, not without agency. We may have made this storm, but we can still choose to escape it. And we can develop, as you put it, that sense of climate justice. And justice, of course, was another central tenet of W.K. Hancock's work. You've shown us how reflecting on archives held in institutions like this can widen our knowledge of the past, but also widen our knowledge for and our choices for an unfolding present and set us into the future. You have cast us all as actors in our own history. And as we leave this room, or leave the meeting as Zine would have it, we have all been inspired and empowered by what we have seen and heard tonight. For all this, Ruth, we warmly thank you. And on behalf of all the friends, we have a small gift, and I'd like you to receive it in a socially distant way.
Oh, yes. Good elbow tapping, Bruce. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, just to close on, we have to thank everyone that made this unprecedented event possible. We've not done this before. Catherine Dan, our capable chair tonight, and our exemplary university librarian. Kendina Spence of the digital literacy team, and Patrick Byrne, Nick Walburn, and all from Library Communications who carried this event to you online. We weren't relying on the Telegraph tonight, thank God. The archive staff and library support who guided us through the building tonight and who guide us through these great collections every day of the week. Colleen McEwen and Maggie Shapley, who provided us with welcome cheer and drinks and sustenance, and Ewan Maidment, our able secretary, who tirelessly promoted the lecture through history and archive networks across Australia and beyond. And of course, all the hardworking and volunteer committee members of the Friends of the Noel Butler Archives. Finally, of course, we thank our audience here and elsewhere who've engaged with this event in such creative and inquiring ways. Now, if you want to continue and enlarge that conversation, why not consider joining the Friends of the Noel Butler Archives? The cost truly is a pittance, and the rewards, as you have seen tonight, are simply immense. You'll find all the details on our website, and there you will also find Ruth's splendid lecture and the other great lecture in this series. On that note, let's all of us, wherever we are tonight, join once again together in another hearty round of applause for Ruth. That concludes the 2020 lecture. Have a safe evening and take care.